Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. So what I'd like to do is kind of go through a step-by-step little description of how you're going to graph absolute value inequalities. Now, this is very similar to the video I made for absolute value equations, but I'm just going to kind of go through that and then add what do we need to do differently for inequalities compared to equations. So when graphing absolute value inequalities, the first thing is just like equations, identify what are your transformations, right? We know that the parent graph looks like this. Y equals absolute value of x. Well, when graphing equations or inequalities, there's going to be some transformations, right? You're going to have your a, your x, your h, your b, and all these things. So write down what are those transformations. Identify what am I going to be doing? Shifting left and right, up and down. Am I going to be reflecting? Is there going to be a stretch or a compress? Identify what you're going to be doing. Then the next thing is identify what about the graph. Is the graph going to be a part of the solution or not? If it's a part of the solution, that means we're going to graph it solid with a solid line. If it's not a part of the solution, then we're going to use dash. And the way to determine that is just to look at the inequality symbol. If the inequality symbol is greater than or equal to or less than or equal to, then it's going to be solid and a part of the solution. If it's greater than or less than, then it's not a part of the solution and we graph it as a dashed graph. The next thing is to identify the vertex, and the vertex of this parent graph is at 0, 0. So if I'm shifting left or right or up or down, that vertex is going to move. So we want to be able to identify where exactly that vertex is going to move. Then, based on where now we plot our new vertex, and I say graph using the parent graph or table. If the only thing we have is shifting left and right, up and down, and reflecting, then we can just use the slopes from the parent graph just to draw the graph from this vertex, because it's going to have the same slopes going from the vertex, even if it's going downward instead of upward. So we can just use the parent graph to graph our graph. However, if we have a dilation, that means a compression or a stretch horizontally, then we still can just kind of use the parent graph. It gets a little bit more complicated though, so to kind of make things easy, I just like to use a table. And the way I like to use a table is identify the vertex and where the axis of symmetry is. Then I just use a table of values for points either to the right or to the left of that vertex, evaluate for those points, and then once I plot the points, I reflect them over the axis of symmetry so then I can make my nice V-graph. The next thing is to test our solution. So at this point, we'll have a nice inequality, absolute value inequality graph, either dashed or solid, and it's going to apply its transformations. Now we need to determine, well, what about the points? Are the points above or below the graph going to be true or false? So we want to choose a test point, and the best test point to choose is 0, 0, as long as your graph doesn't go through 0, 0. So we choose 0, 0 or any other point if we need to, and we plug in those coordinates. So our test, our point has an x and a y coordinate. Plug in those values for x and y into your equation, and if it is true, that means all the points. So let's say we choose a test point that is below below our graph. If when we plug in the x and the y coordinates of that point into our equation and our inequality becomes true once simplified, that means all the points below the graph are going to be true. So we shade lines below to represent all the solutions. If that point was false, that means all the points are false and all the points above the graph are going to be true. So we'd shade above the true. And that's the same if we chose a test point that was above it and it became true, then you shade above. If it's false, then you shade below. But there you go, ladies and gentlemen. That is just kind of your basic description on how to graph absolute value inequalities. Thanks.